The judge's eyes narrowed. "Remove that medal now." The room froze. All eyes turned to the man in red, the silent soldier standing at the back of the courtroom. No one moved. No one breathed.
A simple click on that subscribe button might seem small, but to me, it means the world. If this content made you smile, feel inspired, or just brought you a little joy, hit that sub button and stay with me for more good vibes ahead.
She had no idea what that tiny bronze cross truly meant. But within minutes, the courtroom would fall silent, then rise to their feet. What did she discover? And why did it change everything? Before we reveal the moment that stopped a courtroom cold, hit that subscribe button and stay with us, because this is not just a story about justice. It's about honor, sacrifice, and the medal no judge has the right to dismiss. The air in courtroom 3 was heavy, not with noise, but with anticipation. The judge's gaze locked onto the scarlet figure at the back of the room. Her eyes narrowed, voice sharp as steel. "Remove that medal now." Every head turned toward the man standing silently. Colour Sergeant Daniel Harrow, Coldstream, guards his polished uniform immaculate, his boots glinting beneath the brass-lit ceiling. But it wasn't his stoic posture or towering presence that held the room in thrall. It was the small bronze cross resting over his heart. The Victoria Cross, silence settled taut as wire. No one moved. Even the defendant, once defiant, now glanced toward the soldier with uneasy curiosity. The judge's order hadn't simply startled the room. It had fractured something deeper. Reverence, confusion, disbelief. The clerk fumbled with papers. A military liaison shifted uncomfortably. And yet Harrow remained motionless, his stillness more commanding than any shouted protest. He wasn't being defiant. He was following orders that had brought him here not to intimidate, but to bear witness. Still, the judge wasn't done. "This is a court of law, not a military parade," she continued, her voice colder. "That decoration doesn't belong here." But what she didn't yet know, what the entire courtroom was about to discover, is that the story behind that medal wasn't ceremonial. It was earned not in ceremony, but in gunfire and blood, in decisions made when seconds meant lives. Before the truth could speak for itself, the tension in the room had only one question hanging in the air, like a blade. What could possibly make a judge fall silent in mid-sentence and a courtroom rise to its feet? Hours before that courtroom showdown morning had broken over Wellington Barracks with gray light filtering through tall windows. The quiet hum of military ritual began same as it had for decades. Boots being polished, brass, buttons gleaming. Uniforms adjusted with exacting care. Colour Sergeant Daniel Harrow sat near a corner window, focused not on the chaos ahead, but on the familiar task in his hands, polishing each button of his scarlet tunic with quiet precision. At 34, Harrow moved with the unspoken discipline of someone forged by more than drills or salutes. His calm came not from routine, but from years spent in places where calm kept you alive. Beside his kit sat an envelope creased only slightly from careful handling. Cream-colored. Official. It had arrived the night before a summons to Westminster Magistrates' Court, citing disruption of ceremonial protocol. No explanation, just orders. "Bit odd, innit?" murmured Corporal Jenkins nearby. "Court appearance." In full dress, Harrow didn't look up. Orders are orders. But Jenkins lowered his voice. "They really want the Victoria Cross on display for a civil-cade." That made Harrow pause. For just a moment, his hand froze over the small bronze cross pinned near his collarbone. He said nothing further. 3 weeks earlier, a peaceful protester had broken through a ceremonial barrier, more noise than threat, but a viral video and public outrage had ignited legal firestorms. The footage told only part of the truth. Now Harrow was being pulled into a courtroom not because of what he'd done, but because of what he represented. Orders were orders, but some uniforms carry weight far heavier than they appear. By 7:30 a.m., Harrow stood before a mirror, adjusting his dress uniform one last time. Every crease was sharp, every brass detail flawless. But all eyes would fall inevitably on the Victoria Cross, forged from cannons captured in Crimea, awarded only for the highest acts of valor in the face of the enemy. He had earned his in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, but he rarely thought about that day, not for lack of memory, but because some moments are too sacred or too painful to revisit. He didn't wear the cross for glory. He wore it because 23 men had returned home thanks to what he did. That medal to him was a responsibility, not a symbol. Rain misted the windows of the vehicle as it arrived at Westminster Magistrates Court. Outside, protest signs waved. Cameras flashed. But Harrow didn't react. He never did. Years of real combat had taught him that stillness was strength. Inside the court buzzed with chatter and tension. Courtroom 3 was nearly full, journalists in the back, activists scattered throughout, and legal officials crowding the center rows. Harrow entered through the side, his footsteps the only sound. As he stood silently, the scarlet of his tunic caught the light like a flare. One by one, people began to recognize the medal. Murmurs spread. A child whispered. A grandfather nodded solemnly. "That's the Victoria Cross, lad. Only a few living men wear one." And then the judge entered. She spotted the uniform instantly. Her jaw set. That's when she said it. "Remove that medal." But before she could finish her sentence, the truth behind that cross was already gathering like a storm waiting to break. The command hung in the air. "Remove that medal." Silence fell. Not the polite kind, but the breathless quiet that follows something profound. Judge Margaret Thornton, known for her discipline and no-nonsense rulings, had just challenged a medal that most people in that room had only ever seen in history books or documentaries. Sergeant Harrow didn't flinch, didn't blink. His bearing remained perfect, the stillness of a man who had stood under fire and not moved a muscle until every life behind him was safe. The clerk leaned in, speaking in a hushed voice. "Your Honor, Sergeant Harrow is here in ceremonial capacity. Full dress uniform was required, including medals." Judge Thornton didn't look away. Her voice sharpened. "Uniforms I understand, but that," she pointed with her pen, "that's a war medal. It has no place in a civilian court." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Harrow still said nothing. "I will not have symbols meant to sway, to intimidate, or to dramatize these proceedings," the judge continued. "Either that decoration is removed or he is." At that moment, a voice broke the tension. "Ma'am," came the respectful tone of Major Richardson, liaison officer for the court military interface. "That medal is the Victoria Cross. By military protocol, it must remain on his uniform when appearing in official capacity." "I don't care if it's the crown jewels," Thornton snapped. "This is my courtroom." And then came the whisper. Not loud, but clear enough to ripple through the gallery. "That's the highest award for bravery." The truth now spoken aloud shifted the balance. The room had changed. Two systems, judicial order and military honor, were facing off, both absolute in their own worlds. But only one man stood in between. And then Harrow finally spoke. "Permission to remain as instructed, ma'am. Orders were to appear in full dress, medals included. No arrogance, no emotion, just the calm assertion of duty done." Even the judge for a moment hesitated, because something about this soldier felt immovable. The judge studied Harrow, her eyes flickering with calculation. She had seen theatrics before, lawyers who postured, defendants who grandstanded. But this was different. Harrow didn't seek attention. He simply embodied something the room wasn't prepared for. Judge Thornton tapped her gavel once. "Very well, let the record show the court objects to the display. But we will proceed." But the mood had already shifted. What had begun as a civil case now felt like something more, something historical. Lyle Granger, the 22-year-old protester at the center of the case, kept glancing back at Harrow. The man he'd never met, but whose presence was making him feel very small. Every time his eyes landed on that cross, his expression changed, less sure, more subdued. His lawyer, Sarah Turner, stood, sharp, eloquent, normally commanding. But today, she seemed measured, even cautious. "Your Honor," she began, "my client stands accused of disrupting a lawful ceremony. But I argue that the true disruption here is the unnecessary militarization of civic space." She gestured toward Harrow. The presence of a decorated soldier in full regalia, complete with a combat rifle, could be seen as prejudicial. It was a valid legal point. Courts must be impartial. But the argument struggled under the weight of reality. Prosecutor James Crawford responded, "The uniform and medal are part of formal protocol as directed by the court. His presence is no more theatrical than the robes we wear or the flags above our heads." Judge Thornton looked again at Harrow. Something in his stillness seemed to answer the unspoken questions better than any argument. Finally, she asked Sergeant to step forward. Harrow moved. 3 deliberate steps, silent despite his boots. When he stopped, the room felt as though it had braced itself. The judge's voice softened slightly. "State your name and rank." "Colour Sergeant Daniel Harrow, Coldstream Guards." "And were you present at the event in question?" "Yes, ma'am. Part of the ceremonial escort." Even now, his tone held nothing theatrical. Just facts, duty, service. And that was when the room truly began to listen. Judge Thornton leaned back, steepling her fingers. In your opinion, Sergeant, was the disruption severe enough to justify this court case? Harrow didn't not rush to answer. He took a breath, a soldier's pause. The kind that weighs every word because it understands the cost of words unmeasured. The individual crossed secured barriers and approached the procession, he said. Police responded with appropriate force. No one was harmed. It was calm, neutral, not defensive, and it resonated with truth. Sarah Turner rose again. Sergeant, you carry a ceremonial weapon. You wear a medal awarded in combat. Do you not believe such imagery might intimidate civilian voices of protest? This was the crux, the legal trap. If Harrow said yes, he admitted his presence could bias the courtroom. If no, he'd sound dismissive of real concerns. But Harrow didn't flinch. Ma'am, he said, I wear what I earned. The uniform represents service. The medals represent sacrifice. If someone finds that intimidating, perhaps they should ask themselves why. The answer hung in the air like smoke after a volley undeniable and complete. Judge Thornton looked as if she might press further, but then paused. Something had shifted again. Something unspoken. Sergeant, she said, explain the significance of that medal. He nodded once. The Victoria Cross is awarded for valor in the presence of the enemy, ma'am. And when did you receive it? 2018, ma'am, in Helmand Province. The words struck like a bell. Afghanistan, still fresh, still raw. But before another question could be asked, a voice rose from the gallery. If I may address the court, every head turned. An older man, crisp and dressed, stood. He hadn't been announced as a witness. He wasn't on the docket, but his presence demanded attention. I'm Colonel Robert Mallister, he said. Retired, I commanded Sergeant Harrow in Helmand. Judge Thornton blinked. This wasn't in her plan, but what came next would rewrite the courtroom's understanding of why that medal could never ever be removed. Courtrooms aren't made for battlefield stories, but when Colonel Robert Mallister stood, the atmosphere changed. The judge hesitated. Technically, he had no right to speak, but something in his posture, ramrod straight, eyes clear, cut through protocol. This is irregular, Judge Thornton warned. I understand, ma'am, Mallister replied, but since you're questioning the presence of that medal, I believe it's time someone explained what it actually represents. The room held its breath. No one moved. Even the defense lawyer didn't object. Mallister didn't approach the bench. He didn't need to. His voice, though quiet, filled the room. It was July 15th, 2018. Temperature was 48 degrees Celsius. Our convoy was moving between Lashkargah and Camp Bastion. The lead vehicle struck an IED. The rear was cut off by small arms fire. We were ambushed, pinned. His words, calmly delivered, painted a scene more harrowing than any testimony the courtroom had heard before. We had wounded caught in the open. No orders could be given. Communications were jammed. But one man didn't wait. He looked at Harrow, still standing motionless. He wasn't the senior officer. He wasn't even required to act. But he ran into fire not once, not twice, but 3 times. First was smoke grenades to provide cover, then to drag Corporal Baines to safety, then to carry Lieutenant Shea unconscious and bleeding over 40 meters under fire. Someone in the gallery gasped softly. No one shushed them. When enemy fighters advanced, Sergeant Harrow held the line alone. 43 minutes. He fired 27 rounds, scored 27 hits. Even the journalists had stopped typing. Mallister's voice dropped slightly. I recommended him for the Victoria Cross. When the review board asked why I told them the truth, he stood his ground so that 23 men could return home. No hesitation, no orders, just courage. He looked at the judge. If that medal makes you uncomfortable, Your Honor, it's because most of us haven't earned the right to judge it. He didn't mean it unkindly, just truthfully. And for the first time all morning, the courtroom was not debating. It was listening. Judge Thornton sat perfectly still, pen resting against her fingertips. The courtroom was silent, not in confusion now, but in clarity. Something ancient and sacred had been laid bare. She looked at Harrow. He hadn't moved. Not a flicker of pride, not a glance of emotion, as if the story shared wasn't about him at all. Only the facts. Only the duty. Colonel, the judge said softly, thank you for your clarification. She turned back to Harrow. Sergeant, you may remain in full dress, full honors. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The statement carried weight, not just legal authority, but human understanding. There was no applause. It wasn't that kind of moment. But the room breathed differently now. What had felt controversial had become sacred. Even Ms. Turner, the defense attorney, stood with a changed demeanor. Her earlier arguments now seemed misaligned with the truth she had just heard. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but subdued, "the defense withdraws its objection to the guard's presence." Judge Thornton nodded, noted, and accepted. She glanced again at Harrow, then at the small bronze cross glinting on his chest. "Let the record show this court recognizes the difference between ceremony and service. One may be questioned, the other must be respected." The trial resumed, but it no longer felt like just a legal proceeding. Everything that followed unfolded with a new gravity. Even the young defendant, Lyle Granger, appeared changed. His posture, once stubborn, was now quiet, reflective. He kept stealing glances at Harrow, not with defiance, but with the uneasy realization that the world was larger, heavier, and more complicated than hashtags and headlines. The case in legal terms had barely begun, but the real judgment had already been rendered. The trial moved forward, though now every argument, every line of cross-examination felt different, anchored by context. Granger's actions were not violent. He had crossed barriers, disrupted ceremony, made noise. But he hadn't hurt anyone. His protest was about military spending, but he couldn't have known that the soldier standing behind him in court had once held a line under fire so others could live. Eventually, Granger pleaded guilty to a minor charge. Court granted a conditional discharge, balancing law with mercy. Justice served technically, but the law wasn't the only thing everyone would remember. Because just before adjournment, something happened that wasn't in the script. Colonel Mallister stood again, then Major Richardson, then a civilian man in the front row, then another. One by one, silently, the entire courtroom rose to their feet. They didn't salute, they didn't clap. They just stood, in quiet recognition of something greater than verdicts and motions. Even Judge Thornton stood, not as a judge, but as a citizen. At the center of it all, Harrow remained still, composed. But there was a shift in his eyes, just the smallest flicker of recognition. As he turned to leave, Judge Thornton spoke one final time. "Sergeant Harrow." He stopped, turned. She looked at him, her voice no longer edged in formality. "Thank you for your service and for reminding this court what service truly means." He nodded once, then exited into the London mist. Outside, the rain had begun again, light silvery, ordinary. But inside courtroom 3, something extraordinary had taken place. Not just a hearing, a reckoning, a lesson, a reminder that some honors don't seek recognition, but command it by the weight of what they represent. As Harrow stepped through the heavy courthouse doors, the light rain welcomed him with soft taps against polished brass and crimson wool. He moved down the stone steps with the same measured pace he had carried through deserts, through barracks, through battlefields. His uniform remained flawless, his presence unshaken. Behind him, the courtroom exhaled, the session officially adjourned. People resumed conversations, scribbled closing notes, adjusted umbrellas. But in courtroom 3, a residue of something lingered, something weightier than verdicts, something that couldn't be filed in a docket or cited in legal precedent. The clerk who had earlier shuffled nervously now looked contemplative. The journalist who had first arrived chasing headlines had quietly stopped writing. Even the defense team stood a little straighter. Not because of anything Harrow had said, but because of everything he didn't need to say. As he reached the edge of the square, a voice called softly from behind. A woman in plain clothes, a court translator, offered him a quiet nod. "Thank you," she said. He didn't respond, just met her eyes for a moment and continued walking. For Sergeant Harrow, acknowledgement had never been the goal. He had long ago accepted that true acts of valor are rarely witnessed, even more rarely understood. But today, unexpectedly, his presence had done more than uphold a ceremonial protocol. It had reminded a courtroom and everyone in it what service truly looks like when stripped of pageantry. A life risked without applause. A medal worn not to shine but to carry. A school group passed by the front steps of the courthouse holding folders and umbrellas. Guided by a young teacher clearly trying to keep them in line. London's drizzle misted their jackets, but the children buzzed with excitement, field trip energy, unfazed by history, unaware of context. Until one of them paused. He tugged gently at his teacher's coat sleeve, eyes fixed on the tall figure walking toward the street. "Miss," he whispered, "is that a real soldier?" The teacher turned, her gaze followed the child's. She took in the silhouette, the bearskin hat, the scarlet tunic, the rifle, the medal. Everything about the man walking through the morning rain felt both out of place and utterly grounded, like a time traveler stepping through modern life with quiet purpose. Yes, she said softly, that's a real one. The boy didn't wave. He didn't speak. He just watched. Something unspoken passing between generations. A child still learning the meaning of sacrifice. A soldier still carrying its weight. Harrow didn't turn. He didn't need to. Recognition wasn't his mission. But perhaps in that fleeting moment, the child understood something schools couldn't quite teach. That honor doesn't always come with flags or parades. Sometimes it walks quietly beside us. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you see it just for a second. Back in courtroom 3, the seats emptied, the lights dimmed, the rhythm of bureaucracy resumed. New cases would be heard, new names called, but something had settled in the walls, a presence left behind. The Victoria Cross, that small bronze medal often mistaken for decoration, had never been removed, and no one would ever ask again. Judge Thornton remained at her bench for a moment after adjournment, as if reluctant to re-enter the ordinary world. She looked down at her notes, then past them, eyes distant. She had challenged the presence of a symbol, but what she had encountered was the substance behind it. Honor, duty, sacrifice without recognition. And for once the authority of the court had bowed quietly, respectfully to something older than law. There had been no grand defense, no impassioned speech, just the stillness of a soldier who carried not just a medal, but a memory of heat and dust, of blood and fire, of 43 minutes that changed lives forever. As the courtroom emptied, her clerk approached. "Shall I archive today's proceedings under ceremonial conduct?" The judge paused. "No," she said softly, "archive it under what service really means. Because long after the case faded from memory, long after the headlines moved on, people would still remember the soldier who stood quietly in a courtroom, not to defend himself, but to remind a nation that some things are not displayed. They are carried." In the days that followed, footage from the courtroom circulated, some leaked, some unofficial. No recording had been permitted, but fragments emerged. Still images of the scarlet uniform, quiet testimonies whispered between spectators, one reporter's hand-scribbled recap of Colonel Mallister's words. But no post, no clip, no caption could quite capture the feeling in that room. Comment sections flooded with debate. Some defended the protesters' rights, others praised the judge's willingness to listen. But most were struck by a common truth, the presence of something rare and real. That medal, the Victoria Cross, wasn't just metal and ribbon. It wasn't earned for display. It was earned for decisions made in the absence of safety, for standing one's ground when there was nothing else left to stand on. A woman in the gallery later described it best in a comment. "It wasn't the medal that changed the room. It was the man who wore it like it still hurt." Others who had served reached out anonymously. Veterans, widows, medics. Some recognized Harrow's name. Most had never heard of him, but they all recognized what he represented. He hadn't testified for himself. He hadn't defended his right to wear the cross, because he didn't need to. He had already done the hardest part, earning it without ever asking to be seen. Somewhere between military protocol and courtroom decorum, between the rigidity of the law and the quiet weight of sacrifice, something had happened, something that couldn't be fully defined. The legal system had been challenged by a presence that wasn't there to provoke, intimidate, or even explain itself. It simply existed as a living reminder that not all symbols are abstract. Some carry the blood of others, the lives of 23 men, the echoes of a desert firefight that lasted less than an hour but changed everything. Judge Thornton didn't include those memories in her final ruling. She couldn't. The law doesn't accommodate memory-only fact, and yet her closing words hinted at something more. Some reminders are uncomfortable. That doesn't make them inappropriate. The young protester Lyle Granger left court that day quieter than he arrived. He offered no statements to the press. He didn't pose with his attorney. But someone saw him pause briefly on the courthouse steps, looking out over the street, perhaps in search of a figure already gone. Maybe he had learned something too. That conviction and courage are not always opposing forces. That sometimes the people we protest against have given us the very freedom to speak out. And that medals like the one Harrow wore are not meant to silence dissent, but to defend the right to have it. Weeks later, courtroom 3 looked the same. Same wooden benches, same polished floors, same quiet shuffle of legal proceedings. But for those who had been there, something about it felt different, because tradition had met authority, and neither had bowed. Instead, they had stood side by side, holding space for one another. Colour Sergeant Daniel Harrow returned to duty with the same quiet diligence as before. He was seen occasionally near ceremonial grounds helping train younger guards. He never spoke of the case, never mentioned the courtroom. He didn't need to, because sometimes a moment, just one, becomes part of a larger memory, a communal memory of what dignity under pressure looks like, of how silence can carry truth, and of how a medal, when worn by the right man, can still a room more powerfully than any gavel. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about service. And that's why long after the headlines faded, people still remember the soldier who didn't flinch when a judge told him to remove his cross. He didn't disobey. He simply stood steady as ever, letting the weight of the medal answer for itself. Because some truths aren't loud, they just endure. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Your support truly means the world to me. If this video brought you value or resonated with you in any way, feel free to leave a little comment or hit subscribe so we can keep sharing more moments together. See you in the next one.